Classroom Management for the Middle School Art Teacher, Part 2. We're going to talk today about using reading and writing in the art room for middle schoolers, when it is appropriate and when it is not appropriate. I want to talk about the phenomenon of art teachers using reading and writing as a punishment. It bothers me on a philosophical level, and I do see a lot of it going on in the online art teacher groups that I belong to. In my personal experience, punishment for the sake of punishment alone does not work. I'm not going to suggest that you abandon the practice entirely. What I'm suggesting here is a more nuanced approach that I think will get you better results. I haven't given a detention in years. I haven't punished for the sake of punishing in years because I discovered that for me it simply didn't work. I had a situation years ago where I had a student who kept misbehaving, kept disrupting my classes, and I kept giving him detentions. It happened over and over and over again. This was when I was a young teacher, maybe 30 years old. And he told me about a year later that the reason why the punishment wasn't working is because he loved me and he really wanted to spend more time with me. So he was actually misbehaving on purpose in the hopes that I would give him a detention. A lot of these students are very hungry for attention, and even if they're not quite as insightful as this student was to be able to articulate it, a lot of times I really do suspect that that's what's going on when a student's disrupting your class. What I have done is I've given kids long direction sheets to read and then only given them the next set of supplies when they've earned them by reading and following a sequence of directions. It served an educational purpose. I wanted them to have some skin in the game. I was giving each child in the class the opportunity to earn privileges, and they had a choice. The class as a whole wouldn't be quiet enough for me to present, so I needed to find another way for them to learn. What I'm seeing in art teacher groups is teachers using art history texts as punishment. At best, this strikes me as poor pedagogy. At worst, it sends an extremely counterproductive message. I love reading, writing, and art history, and want my students to love it too. I see teachers searching for the driest text possible, but the key to turning the class around is to get students to buy into the idea, to make them feel like empowered stakeholders in their own education. Whole class punishment might seem easiest for the teacher, but wouldn't it be more effective to focus on the 2 to 4 kids driving the bad behavior? Teachers want to be able to do this, but most of us don't know how, so I'll give you some suggestions. I once had my worst class break into groups of 3 and do reader's theater. That is, when they have a script and each child acts out a part reading aloud in their small group. Then I gave them an assignment that involved brainstorming a story as a group and drawing a comic strip. The assignment was all explained on the worksheets, so there was zero need for me to get the class to shut up and listen. It was still a paper and pencil lesson because they threw crayons, unfortunately. I actually broke crayons into little bits and threw them around the room. So it was still a paper and pencil lesson. It still required reading, but it increased student engagement and it made them look forward to my class. It also gave me the chance to see who was and wasn't participating. Someone asked me to give an example of the questions that students might have to answer in order to get the supplies to do a project. Here's an example. I gave them a reading passage about the constructivist art movement in Soviet Russia. It was something I put together myself, so it was written in very clear, age-appropriate language. It directly related to the project we were doing. I didn't want to give a few kids in the class CRAYOLA model magic and toothpicks, which we needed for this construction lesson, because they would have thrown it around the room and ruined the activity for the rest of the class. If I just excluded those 3 or 4 kids, they would have cried unfair if I had excluded them. How could I get them to take ownership of the situation and prevent them from ruining art for everyone? So I had a bunch of questions for discussion based on the reading passage. I'll leave the link to the lesson in the description for this video so that you can access it yourself. But the questions were actually pretty thoughtful questions. Why do you think Vladimir Tatlin's tower was never built? What made the constructivists different from other sculptors? Why do you think a building might be more stable if the designer used triangular braces? How can triangular bracing keep a building from collapsing? Describe the geometric forms that Tatlin was planning to place within the tower. What shapes did he choose? And what were they supposed to symbolize? Where did the constructivists get their ideas from? At the time when Vladimir Tatlin designed his monument, what building was the tallest building in the world? How do you think Gustav Eiffel was able to create such a tall building without it collapsing? What technique was used by both Vladimir Tatlin and Gustav Eiffel? How big would the monument to the Third International have been had it been built? What do you think would happen if you tried to build a tall toothpick structure out of cubes instead of tetrahedrons? Give some examples of how artists can get ideas from other people who came before them. Now, this was prior to a toothpick sculpture lesson. The most destructive kids in the class went crazy because they weren't given toothpicks and clay to throw around the room, but they still refused to answer the questions. However, this forced them to watch as other kids did this fun, interesting project and built these beautiful towers. Eventually, they realized that I was not going to give in. They either had to earn the privilege by doing the work or watch the other kids have fun. I called their parents to explain my side of it. I even offered to stay after school with them and walk them through the lesson if they found it too hard. I had cleared all of this with the administration ahead of time, so they knew what complaints they were likely to have to field from parents. And because of the way I framed it, administration backed me. One by one, the disruptive kids did the work, realizing it was the only way they were going to get their hands on clay. But then, once they actually answered the questions and got the materials, and one kid even stayed after school and did it with me. We just did it one-on-one. What happened was amazing. They got the materials and they started designing stuff. It was transformative. The very act of paying attention and learning the concepts made them want to build and not destroy. They didn't even understand it. When they asked me, hey, how is it that I'm building stuff and creating things and doing all this work? Why is it that I'm suddenly so engaged in this lesson when if you'd given me the clay and the toothpicks before, I would have, and they readily admitted, thrown them around the room. So when they asked me, all I said was, you had to have some skin in the game. Having done all that work to earn the materials, you weren't about to throw them. Now, one stubborn child ended up being the lone holdout. He simply refused on some sort of crazy principle. I think it was almost like he felt like going ahead and doing what I asked was somehow letting me win. And that was a choice that he made, and I accepted it. He's now 22, and I hear through the grapevine that he just got out of prison. I'm not sure what his plans are. We all make choices.